Right. Hello there, everybody. How's it going? What's up, Mike? Got this faithful group of 8 to 10 that shows up every week. So it's nice though. Sounds like it's pretty consistent across the board. It's like minimal people that actually tune in. I think it's because it's recorded. So, but you get the opportunity to see me live in action, I suppose. All right. Today we're going to kick off with Axial. I always pronounce it wrong. I say axial. I'll switching back and forth between them today. We'll talk about the axial musculature. So without further ado, I am going to start sharing my screen. Let's see here. Put this up over here. Oh, that's a little creepy. There you go. All right. So just like with every other lab, you got that nice little intro sheet up there on Canvas. So if I pull that up real quick, I suppose I'll get out of PowerPoint for a second. Here, so you can pull this up, and it's going to tell you what we need to know for this week. So in addition to the muscles, the axial muscles, we're going to need to know origin, insertion, and action of these muscles. Okay. So we actually have a nice little, I'll keep going back to this prematurely, but we have this sheet here for you, an Excel file that we've compiled. And it looks a little daunting, but it's not too bad. So we have our list of the axial muscles we need to know. And then we have the origin, the insertion, and the action. We've simplified these origin, insertions, and actions quite a bit to make it a bit easier for you to access and understand what's going on. So it's anatomically simplified and then mechanically simplified with these actions as well. Okay. So that is also up on Canvas. You should, of course, print that off and we'll work through that. And then a little bit of background here. I suppose if you're not familiar, the origin of that muscle is the part that's going to tend to stay stationary and tends to be more proximal, while the insertion for that muscle, that's what's going to move toward the origin during a contraction. And it tends to be more distal. So I keep pointing at my arm here, and that's because I'm demonstrating the biceps. This isn't an axial muscle, it's appendicular, but anyway, just good for an example. It's one we all know. So your biceps, your origin is the shoulder, right? That's going to stay stationary during a contraction of that biceps, and it's more proximal, okay? And the insertion then, that biceps can be down in the radius. And we can see that radius is going to move towards that origin during a contraction, okay? Again, take a look at that Excel file that we put up there on Canvas for a list of all those actions, okay? It sounds bad, or I shouldn't say bad, but daunting. But if you know the origin and the insertion for that muscle, then you can guess the movement easily, right? You know what's going to happen. A little bit generalization, the names of these muscles, they often tell us the origin or insertion or the action of that muscle. So for example, we have a sternohyoid muscle. That gives us the origin and the insertion. Or we have a depressor labii muscle. Well, that tells us the action, depresses labii, lip, so lowers the lip. So like usual, we're going to go over some strategies for learning the axial musculature versus, running through every single structures. We'll cover a fair number of structures today, but kind of some tips here. You're actually in pretty good shape because axial muscle sits upon the axial skeleton, which you've already started to review, hopefully, or at least if you're tuning in with me here, we've reviewed it a little bit. Okay. So functions of the axial skeleton here, well, it helps with positioning of the head. It's what allows us to move our face, our jaw, and our eyes, right? So facial articulations. It positions our vertebral column and also assists with breathing by raising and lowering the rib cage. And then, as we'll finish up with today, helps create support for the pelvic floor for all those organs that are in there. Okay. Now, to help with terminology, I'm going to just zip right to the last page of this PowerPoint and hit some terminology with you. All right, so here we have muscle terminology, and knowing these terms is going to help you, it's going to help you understand the names of these muscles, making them easier to memorize. So they're grouped here by action or specific body regions they attach, or even orientation of the muscle fibers. So for example here, we have a muscle action. We could have an adductor, and remember we said adductor would be bringing closer down to your body, so that muscle is going to help with that. So we have an adductor magnus, or specific body regions, right? We have the oris, which you'll learn today is the mouth. So there's this muscle, the orbicularis oris, which encircles the mouth, or the muscle attachment. So that would be that origin and insertion I was talking about. Some muscles are named for that. So one we'll walk through shortly would be the sternocleidomastoid. Just looking at that name, we know there's going to be origins on sternum, cladoid, which is clavicle, okay, and then insertion on the mastoid process of the temporal bone. What else? Orientation of muscle fibers. You've probably heard of your oblique muscles. So an example would be the external obliques we'll review today. And that just refers to the orientation of those fibers. So rectus means straight, whereas oblique means angled or crossing over. Okay. Orbicularis, right? That's circular. Okay, so we had the orbicularis oris up here. It means circular muscle around the mouth. Muscle size, major, minor, you probably recall major means larger, minor means smaller. And then muscle heads, biceps, 2 heads versus triceps, 3 heads. Biceps femoris, triceps brachii. So that's an example of how knowing this muscle terminology will help you out. So make sure you know at least this list and where these terms are coming from. That's the last slide, so I suppose I gotta delve all the way back here. Okay, so we're gonna start with the muscles of the head and the neck today as part of the axial musculature. These are gonna be needed for, well, importantly, especially something us humans do, facial expression. You can get a lot from another person just based on their facial expression. The extraocular muscles, these are what help move the eyes. Okay. Muscles associated with chewing, what we call mastication. Muscles of the tongue, these are necessary for both manipulating food within the mouth and allowing us to form different words. And then the anterior, so the front muscles of the neck, and we'll review all these. All right, so we got a lot here we're going to cover on this slide, but looking at these muscles, just looking at this slide, we can see that there's many layers. This, again, is where complete anatomy is really going to shine because we can eliminate different layers. Notice that little link down here for us. As usual, we got that hyperlink that'll bring you right into complete anatomy. So on the right here, I suppose anatomical left, we can see that the deep musculature, so this is the deep, lies right next to the bone. And this is going to be muscles more involved with jaw movement, some chewing, talking, mastication, right? Some really powerful muscles are found here. And then on the left here, or anatomical right, we see more superficial muscles. Okay? These being closer to the surface tend to be more related to expression, facial expression. Okay? Many of these muscles have origin directly on the bone, so on the skull somewhere, and then a lot of the insertions are on the skin, and that's a little bit unique for muscles. Oftentimes they're not with the skin, but this is really helpful for making those facial expressions that we need to communicate with other people. Let's work through some individual muscles here. bust out my handy pen. Let's start with one we've mentioned. Let's see. I guess we haven't mentioned this one particular, but we've mentioned the orbicularis, what that means. So here we have the orbicularis oculi. So orbicularis, if we think back to our terminology sheet we just reviewed, that means to encircle an opening. We can see we're doing that. We're encircling the eye socket there. Okay. And then oculi just means eye. So this one's named after the region. So this is encircling the eye, which is what this muscle is doing. And you can imagine then a contraction. If this were to contract, right, the radius of that, or the diameter, would get smaller. Okay, and that forces the eye shut. So that's how we close our eyes during a blink. Okay. Over here on the deep side, we can look, how are we going to open that eye back up? Well, here we see another muscle, which we can break this name down to figure out what it's going to do. We see the levator palpebrae superioris. So levator, levitate, means to lift. Palpebrae, just a fancy word for eyelid. Okay. In fact, the space between your eyelids, they call the palpebrae fissure, palpebral fissure. And then we have the superioris. So superior, we mean above. So this simply means lift eyelid above. So that's how we open the eye. Go down to another one of our orbicularis muscles here. Now we have the orbicularis oris. So encircling the mouth. And that's exactly what this muscle does. Okay. Some other muscles that are going to be important to know. We have the risorius. This is one of my favorites because, well, just picture a contraction of this muscle here. What's it going to do? Well, it's going to pull your mouth back to the sides, right? And this is that little smug smile that we give each other in the hallway when we're passing each other, like, you know what I'm talking about, where you don't open your mouth. It's like a half smile. And that's responsible or due to the risorius muscle contracting. Okay. The hallway smile. It's another one here. Here's another one that's pretty simple to figure out. Depressor labii inferioris. So depressor, depression, so lowering, lip, and it's found below. So we got depressor labii inferioris, lower lip below. Contraction, as you can imagine then, we're contracting these fibers. It's going to pull that lower lip down. Nasalis, sounds kind of cool, bridges the nose here. The nasalis, if you can picture in a contraction of this muscle here, oh, what's that going to do? These are called your nares. So that's going to flare your nostrils. Okay, the nasalis, contraction of the nasalis. Here we have one of the stronger bones in the face, the masseter, massive chewing muscle. And masseter, you can remember because it sounds like masticate, which is to chew. It also helps close the mouth, provides a lot of downforce. And then probably my favorite facial muscle here, deep to the masseter, we can see the buccinator. Yeah, I just love that word. And that kind of, it's a strong muscle and it helps form the cheeks. It stops your cheeks from blowing out. So trumpet players, for example, any trumpet players here, strong buccinator muscles. You know, if anyone's heard of Dizzy Gillespie, trumpet player, massive cheeks, he's got massive buccinator muscles for blowing on that horn, okay? So that was a quick review of these facial muscles. This slide's good for showing us the origin insertion. And again, complete anatomy will be nice because you can isolate these different muscles. All right, let's go on to the external eye muscles then. So I talked about these a little bit in lecture because it's, well, we need these to get convergence of the eye. So let's say you're looking at your computer screen right now up close, you're looking at a book. We got to pull those eyes more medial to the center line in order to focus on that book, okay? And we can also have muscles that pull the eye more lateral to look straight ahead, parallel to something. Okay? And these are named primarily for the orientation of their fibers. So remember on that terminology sheet, we had things like rectus and oblique, okay? So straight versus angled or crossing. There are 6 of these external eye muscles. It's actually a pretty nice model of this that is in 110. Okay, that in New Science 110. So you can look at all those different external eye muscles. Model's getting kind of beat up, but I think the muscles are still in decent shape. I don't think the lens is there anymore. But what's nice about these is you can imagine, we actually usually do a demo with like a beach ball and we have little strings attached to it and we pull them and it kind of like, just like a puppet, it's going to turn that eye to do what we want. So you can just imagine if these muscles were individual strings, right? Well, they're fibers, so they kind of are. And if you were to pull or contract one of those, you can look at what the movement of that eye is going to do. So for example, let's start with an easy one. Let's look at the lateral rectus. Okay, so this is the lateral rectus. So this would be fine more laterally, obviously not medially. Okay. And you can imagine a contraction of this muscle. Okay. Well, what is that going to do? Okay. Well, it's going to pull this eyeball around laterally, right? Looking out to the side. So look out to the edge. Right? So it's as simple as pulling strings on a puppet here, but your puppet's the eyeball. What else? So that's your, we got a, well, let's flip it around here. We got a medial rectus. So now this would be looking at the inside here. Medial rectus, imagine contraction here. That's going to allow for convergence. That's going to pull those eyes more medially to allow us to focus on my hand, for example. We have a superior rectus. Goes on and inserts on the front. Again, contraction of that muscle. Allows us to look upward, rotates the eye upward. Then perhaps a little more confusing is, let's see if I can bust out an eraser here. Well, not too confusing if we think about the orientation of these fibers or where they end up. So we have this superior oblique. Remember we said oblique means to kind of cross over or be angled. And that's what we have going on with this muscle. So we can see the superior oblique. It's going up here, it's on top of the eye, and then it's got a little tendon hook here, right? And it actually inserts this tendon over on this part of the eye, right? So it's oblique, so it's crossing over. Again, if you think about the action here, what is that going to do if we contract this muscle back here? Well, it's kind of up top the eye, so it's going to make that eye look down, and then it's over on the lateral side of the eye, so it's going to, again, pull that eye in that direction. So this superior oblique, which crosses over and attaches on the lateral side, pulls the eye downward and laterally, okay? So just look at your origin and insertion and action sheet for help with these, but you can guess pretty much what's going to happen with contraction. Here we get a better view, I guess, of the masseter. You can see that very large muscle involved with mastication. And then deep to that, my favorite muscle, the buccinator, a bugle muscle. Sounds like baconator. I think that's why I like it. All right, moving on to the muscles of the neck. These are mostly important for, well, moving your neck, obviously, and chewing, mastication. Lots of these are named for their origin and insertion. With these names, the origin is going to be the first part of the muscle name, and then the insertion will be the second. Okay. Notice again, we got that complete anatomy link down here, so you can take a better look at these and manipulate individual muscles. Let's start with an obvious one that you perhaps might have heard of before, the sternocleidomastoid. Okay. This is one of those that's named for the origin and then the insertion. Okay. This is a more obvious one because this is one that we can both see and feel. I tend to pull this one a lot too, unfortunately. Okay. So with this one, we got 2 origins. We can see the sternocleidomastoid here. So one, obviously being the sternum. The second one being the clavicle. Clado means referring to the clavicle. So we got sternocleidoid, and then insertion is going to be up on the mastoid. Okay, so the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So contraction then is going to lead to flexion of the neck, right? So bringing your chin down to your sternum, or extension. Okay. You can also imagine just contracting one sternocleidomastoid muscle, right? This is a unilateral contraction because we're going to have bilateral symmetry here. You're going to have that muscle on the other side, right? So that's going to tilt your head one way or the other if we just contract one of those. Another one we should look at, which is just origin and insertion names, would be here's a good one, sternohyoid, right? So sterno, we know that that's going to go to the sternum. Again, it's a little bit deeper than our sternocleidomastoid, and then up to the hyoid bone. Okay, sternohyoid. And then I'll just mention this kind of a goofy one here. We got the digastric. Okay, so we break that word down, di to gastric, stomach. So whoever was kind of naming these, they ended up thinking that these muscles kind of looked like little stomachs. So they named it the two stomachs. And in fact, we call them the bellies. Okay, so we have an anterior belly, located right here, and then deep, a posterior belly. Okay, those make up the digastric. All right, muscles of the vertebral column. We have two divisions here, the extrinsic back muscles and the intrinsic back muscles. Now, extrinsic, we're actually going to cover as part of the appendicular. So today we're just going to focus on these intrinsic back muscles, which are the deepest muscles of the back, most internal. Okay, and the deepest of these muscles is comprised of these three different layers. So intrinsic here, the superficial, the intermediate, and the deep. And these are all responsible for connecting vertebrae and then stabilizing vertebrae. One second. Can you all hear me okay? Are you nodding yes? That's weird. It's on my end. It says there's a microphone issue, but if you can hear me, then I'm just going to keep rolling.
I noticed there aren't subtitles this time. Do you think that's it?
Yeah. I don't know. I just got microphone issue down on mine. Yeah, maybe it must be my internet. I don't know. Is that okay with you if there's no subtitles? Okay. Sorry, I don't know what the deal is, but all right, I'll go back to this. All right, so let's dig into these intrinsic muscles. All right, so we mentioned there's three layers. The superficial, okay, they run up and down along the vertebral column, and they include the splenius muscles. And then their intermediate layer, we have the erector spinae. And in fact, I'm probably just going to move on to the next slide because I think it's easier to show you these than just talk about them. Okay, so again, we'll start with the splenius then. So here we have the splenius, and again, they're running up and down next to the vertebral column. Okay, these are going to be the most superficial, okay, of these intrinsic muscles at least. Remember, these intrinsic muscles are the deeper ones. We'll go through the external muscles next time. So they run up and down, and they're involved with extension of the neck, you can imagine, lateral flexion, side to side, and then rotation. That's the splenius muscles. And if we move a little deeper then, let's see, right here, we got the erector spinae. And you can see it's comprised of these three bands of muscles that are also running vertically, so up and down. Now, the closest to the spine of these erector spinae is pretty easy to remember. It's called the spinalis group. Lays right next to the spine. And then lateral to that, we got the longissimus. Okay. So longissimus, more lateral to that. And then most lateral of this three group of erector spinae, we have the iliocostalis group. Okay. Iliocostalis, I guess if we break that down, the iliac crest, remember, so talking about down here on your pelvis, the iliac crest is going to be the origin, and then the costalis, the costa, is where they're going to insert. Do you remember what costa are? So those are your ribs, and we can see just that. So it's running from the iliac crest up to, we can see those insertion points on the individual costa, the ribs. So iliocostalis, the most lateral group of the erector spinae. All right, on to some muscles you've likely heard of before. You've probably heard of your obliques and maybe your rectus muscles, but let's start with one I just mentioned then. I talked about how the costa are your ribs, right? Well, we have both external intercostals and internal intercostals. Okay. So as you can guess, they kind of attach a superior rib to an inferior rib. Okay. And then we have an outer layer, the external, and then deep to that, an internal layer of these muscles. Okay. Now the external, we can look at the orientation of these fibers here. You can see the external make a V. So you can see these are running this orientation, and then on this side, they'd be running this way, right? So they make this deep V. Now picture a contraction then of these fibers in between these ribs. Well, a contraction then is going to lift the cage up and out when we inhale. Okay. Then deep to that, we have these internal intercostals, which make an upside down V. So you can see they'd be running in this orientation. Okay. And you guessed it, those contract and allow us to exhale. Okay. So externals make a V, internal make an upside down V, inhale, exhale. All right, let's move on to the obliques. So remember, obliques, they're just named strictly for that fiber orientation, which oblique means angled, basically just not straight here. Okay, and what's nice about these, the obliques, they make the same pattern as our intercostals, right? So we have external and internal obliques. Now I'm going to try to point these out. This isn't the best model, but if we look here, they've removed some of this here, and we can see the outermost is the external obliques. And our fiber orientation on these, really they've cut away, is this. You can see this. These are your external obliques right here that we can see. Okay. And again, they make a deep V, the external obliques, just like the external intercostals made of V. Okay. And then deep to that, we have internal obliques. And you guessed it, they make an upside down V. Okay. And then deep to these, there's yet a third layer of muscle, which we call the transverse abdominis. We can kind of see this through this little window right here. And they're running transversely. So on the outermost layer here, we got the V, right? And then deep to that, we have the upside down V. And then deep to that, we have these transverse abdominis. Transverse meaning they're running transversely or across. Okay. And if you're getting tripped up on these layers, just go ahead and look here. So this would be anterior right here. This would be posterior. Here's your spine. And we can see the transverse is the deepest, followed by the internal obliques, followed by the external obliques. Okay. And that leaves us with these muscles in front, the rectus abdominis. Rectus meaning straight. They run straight up and down. Okay, You can see they're running like this, right? And this is what we call our six-pack. Okay. Oh, I can go into this. My wife probably won't appreciate it. But these muscles, these rectus abdominis, they can actually separate when you are pregnant. Everything's getting stretched out, and that's called diastasis. So it's kind of, well, we're on our second kid now, but she gets things that'll poke through between those muscles. You can kind of like almost put your hand in there in a really bad case of diastasis. So it's pretty wild just from separation of those muscles. All right, pelvic floor. We often forget about these muscles, but they're pretty important because they kind of hold all our organs in. Manny likes to say it's like the bottom of a grocery bag, right? It's really important, though it's not much to look at. It's holding all the contents in there. So support organs of the pelvic cavity, flexion, and then importantly here, we're controlling movement of things we want to eliminate from the body, right? So feces and urine. And then it's important in the female and male sexual response. And in fact, it actually has a role in both male and female erection, which we'll cover in a second. So what's nice between both female and male, obviously, is we have a lot of shared anatomy in this region. So I'm going to show you some of that shared anatomy. Obviously, we both have anal sphincters, right? So that's going to help with that control of elimination. But then I'm going to point out, so I can flip between male and female, right? So then external anal sphincter, shared anatomy. And then this one right here, the bulbospongiosis. Okay. We'll go bulbospongiosis in the male, right here. And this one gives erection of the clitoris, while in the male, erection of the penis. Okay. And I think that's a good note to end on. So why don't we stop there? And if you got any questions, I will take them now.